Hello, everyone. This is Sandy. Welcome to Beat the Big Guys podcast. I am so excited to have with me today the great Harry Shearer. And I'm going to start out by telling you a little bit about him, but although I'm sure most of you know, but just want to bring you in a little bit on what he's been up to lately. Harry Shearer is best known for his work on both The Simpsons and This Is Spinal Tap. As the man behind the voices of a multitude of characters, most notably Mr. Burns, Smithers, and the insufferable neighbor, Ned Flanders. He's been a key cast member on The Simpsons since it started nearly 27 years ago. He created the character Derek Smalls, who performed alongside Christopher Guest's Nigel Tufnell and Michael McEwen's David St. Hubbins to form Spinal Tap for the 1984 movie, and has since made numerous appearances in legendary rock band On Stage. In addition to his collaborations with Christopher Guest, his TV and movie career has spanned several decades, including the roles in Real Life, The Right Stuff, Portrait of a White Marriage, The Fisher King, Godzilla, The Truman Show, Small Soldiers, and the recently completed Bastards. Harry is a prolific radio broadcaster with a long-running weekly Le Show. He is also known as a satirical songwriter with 4 albums to his name. As a stage actor, he's appeared in starring roles both off and on Broadway and in London's West End. Welcome to Beat the Big Guys, Harry.
Thank you, Sandy. Nice to be here. Thank you for having me. Really
Harry,
appreciate being second in line after Lieutenant General Honore.
Well, not everyone can be first, Harry.
No, I would always defer to General Honore.
So would I. So, Harry, we go back a long way. And I'd like if you would tell our listeners about how you found out about the work that I was doing, specifically when I was trying to get the word out that the Army Corps of Engineers had made a $100 billion mistake in New Orleans.
Yeah, a fatal mistake, as it turns out.
Mm-hmm.
I was in Los Angeles. I was doing the last of the Christopher Guest movies that I was in, which was called For Your Consideration. But I had also signed on as the media editor of the then fledgling Huffington Post. So I was monitoring every shred of media that I could out of New Orleans every day, both for my own personal benefit and for the benefit of the Huffington Post's audience. And so I was devouring all that, got back to New Orleans on November 5th. And very soon after, I spent the next day driving around to just see as much of the damaged area as I could in an automobile. And after 2.5 hours straight of driving, I had to stop. I hadn't come near to seeing it all, but I couldn't see any more that day. Later on, a friend of mine who was in town, who happened to have a helicopter, invited me to ride with him, and we did take a bird's eye view and got a sense of the massive scope of this disaster. But one of the first things I saw when I was back on the ground, or back after that trip, was a yard sign that said, "Hold the Corps accountable." And I was familiar with the Corps of Engineers because growing up in Los Angeles, there was this big ditch that ran through the concrete ditch that ran through the center of town, usually filled with soap suds from laundromats in the San Fernando Valley. And I finally found out, oh, that's the LA River. That's what the Army Corps of Engineers did to it when it once flooded. And they came to the suburban communities of Southeast Los Angeles, Norwalk and Downey in particular, and said, "You want to never flood again? Let us do this." Needless to say, LA has ever since been struggling to restore the river. A poet maybe confusing two people, but anyway, Lewis McAdams was one of the leaders in the movement to restore it to an actual river. And that set me up for understanding the kind of business the Corps of Engineers does. And so when I saw Hold the Corps Accountable, I checked in with you, and we met. We met at your house, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
And you explained what you understood at that time. And that set me off on about a 3-year project to talk on my radio show, Le Show, with the head of the Team Louisiana investigation, Dr. Van Heerden, the co-head of the Berkeley investigation, Dr. Bray.
Van
Oh,
Heerden.
no,
Ivor Van Heerden.
Van Heerden was LSU, but in
Oh,
Berkeley it was
oh, Dr. Bob B.
Dr. Bob B. I was thinking
Yes.
Ray Seed. He was his partner, Dr. Bob B.
Mm-hmm.
And with a person who I encountered who turned out to be a whistleblower from inside the Corps of Engineers regarding the new work that they were doing post-flood. And I thought, well, that's doing something. And then I watched the first presidential visit by Barack Obama to New Orleans in October of 2009.
I remember that well.
And I was watching it on a little laptop. And when I saw him describe the event as a natural disaster, I almost threw the computer into the air because I thought, well, there are two possibilities here. Either he doesn't know, and that's bad, or he does know, and that's bad. So I thought, well, I put him on all these people on the radio. What more can I do? And well, people make documentaries these days. These people probably will trust me because I treated them fairly on the radio. So I went back to some of the same people and interviewed many others for the documentary called The Big Uneasy. And I kind of was trying, I guess, being too smart by half. I thought this was October of 2009. I thought if I really hurried up and made this picture in time, I could open it and show it at the same time as the national media came here for the 5th anniversary. And
That's
they'd have to pay attention to the new information. And I did that, and they didn't do that.
Well, we're going to talk about that some more for sure. The focus of today's episode is you need to make your cause relevant to as big a group as possible. And the advice you gave me, Harry, early on was, Sandy, you're doing good work here and you've got a message, but you need to make your message relevant to the entire country, which was a big bite, but I figured out a way to do it. It was good advice. And just because it's good doesn't mean it's easy. But I realized, and speaking of LSU Hurricane Center, a statistic had come across my desk that 43% of the American people lived in counties with levees. And I thought, well, that's a good way to make this relevant to the entire country. And then I started pushing that statistic, and it did work. It did help bring more national attention. But I realized that, where are those counties? All I knew was a statistic. So I filed a request under the Freedom of Information Act with FEMA. 6 months later, by the way, the law is I'm supposed to get an answer in 3 weeks. 6 months later, I got my answer. And it was good data, but the most important statistic was on the cover page. It turns up it's not 43%, it was 55% of the American people. So now we're more than half of the American people. So you know me, I put that information out there. Every time I got in front of any mic, I said 55% of the American people live by counties protected by levees. And it rolls off my tongue as easily as I say my kid names. Well, I have an update. That was 10 years ago. Last August, I thought it's been 10 years. There's new census data. So again, I filed a request with FEMA for how many people live by counties now. And you ready? It's now up to 62%.
Wow.
Almost 2/3 of the American population lives in counties protected by levees. I don't know why the number keeps going up. That's enough story for another podcast, but there you have it. And I just kept pushing that information out. So Harry, that was amazingly good advice that you gave me. And I jumped on it.
The one that I know about specifically that came to my attention while I was doing this was Sacramento, which happens to be the state capital of the state of California, our largest state. And Sacramento is in a valley that is supposedly protected by levees. And the people in the levee business that I talked to in making the film were almost unanimous in saying that the next disaster was
Hmm.
going to happen in the area of the state capital of our largest state.
Hmm.
And we're
It was.
still waiting.
It was my understanding, Harry, that there were more people at risk of levee failure and saltwater intrusion into their drinking supply than the states of Texas, Mississippi, and Missouri combined.
Hmm.
That was the stat that I
Yeah.
remember from then.
Yeah.
So now I interrupted you for just a moment to remind everybody what the whole purpose of today's episode is. Make your issue relevant, or no one's going to care. No matter how good an issue you have, you need to make it relevant to your listeners. So if we could go back now to the Big Easy, and what did you the Big Easy, which you produced, directed, and wrote. Yeah, you
Hmm.
basically did everything. So what was it that you did how did you follow your own advice when you created the Big Uneasy?
Well, as I said at the earlier part of this program, I was anticipating hitting the national media at a time when they were all converging here, and my my opinion of the national media has been going down in recent years as their body count has. Uh, the most obvious example of that was I tuned in to NBC one Sunday morning, and David Gregory, who I happen to know, was hosting Meet the Press, and he said, "We have a breaking news story this morning from Pakistan, and for the latest, we go to NBC's chief foreign correspondent Richard Engel reporting today from London." And I'm thinking, you can see Pakistan from London? That should be news to Sarah Palin. Uh, it basically the only word in his sentence that was untrue was the word chief. He meant only, and that's the hollowing out that has happened in the national media. That said, I knew all that, but I was not prepared for the fifth anniversary behavior when they came here. Didn't take advantage of any of the new information that had been made available. Didn't interview Van Heerden, didn't interview Bob B, didn't interview anybody else. Basically, they sat here for 2 days just saying, wasn't our coverage 5 years ago great? Look at
Mm-hmm.
Anderson Cooper wagging his finger in Mary Landrieu's face. So I realized at that point I was going to have to do my own national campaign
They
because
stuck with the original template,
yeah,
which was monster storm, city below sea level, and
right,
they're all corrupt down there in New Orleans. That
right.
was the original template that was created maybe 2 weeks after the levees broke.
That's right. And I actually did a talk at the National Press Club about that process whereby producers and editors in New York get a first taste of a story. That becomes the template, and the only thing that they're interested in after that is quotes
Mm-hmm.
that fill out the story of the template. They are not interested in new information. In our case, we had information that negated every one of those. The city is, according to Richard Campanella, who I think reported on this in 2007,
Mm-hmm.
more than half of occupied New Orleans is at or above sea level. The
Right.
most seriously flooded locations were substantially above sea level in certain cases,
Yes.
as in the lower ninth.
Yes.
So that had nothing to do with this. Uh,
Didn't fit the template.
yeah. So I basically put the film under my arm and got bookings in cities across the country and traveled with it to those cities because I knew it showing in your town is not a big a draw as the filmmaker, who happens to be a semi-famous person, will be here to answer your questions with the premiere of the film, and I could get local newspaper coverage that way that would somewhat compensate for the lack of national news coverage. Uh,
Are you
I
pleased with how that went? That campaign
no,
went?
no. I mean, I was pleased that it did what I set out to do, but it didn't really compensate for the lack of national news coverage. I think most people, if you ask them in the country, would still say that New Orleans got hit, which it didn't,
Mm-hmm.
by a mammoth hurricane that flooded it. And of course, the hurricane passed 35 miles to our northeast,
Mm-hmm.
something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And the damage was done. The thing that I found most puzzling, because of course pictures are a great way to tell any story. If you showed somebody the picture of the hurricane damage, which did occur on the Mississippi Gulf Coast, and then you showed them a picture of the damage occurred in New Orleans, they looked totally different.
Mm-hmm.
Flood damage is an effect of water coming at tremendous rates of speed that knock buildings off their foundations and send them 3 or 4 blocks in the other direction.
Mm-hmm.
Hurricane damage blows buildings down. Wind damage blows them down. There's sticks on the ground. Totally different. You could understand the difference between what happened in as a result of a natural phenomenon and the result of what happened as a result of the Corps'
$100 billion
misfeasance.
mistake.
Yeah, it's black and white.
Mm-hmm.
Those two pictures are all you. So what I ran into with the national media people to a great extent, and I think people who try to tell their story to major league media really need to watch out for this. In my understanding of journalism, a journalist's role is to go into the weeds, study the details so they can be comprehensible to the average reader, viewer, listener. In the case of this story, they didn't want to get into the weeds. They thought it was too complex. The fact that you had 2 pictures that could tell the story in 10 seconds never occurred to them or never swayed them.
It was too complex.
Too complex. They don't want to get in the weeds. And they'll actually say that sometimes. They'll actually say those words. So if you're trying to get your story out and you want to if you've already done the work of trying to make it relevant to an audience beyond your locality, the next job you have to do is, it's like you have to eat their food for them.
And can you elaborate a little?
Yeah, you have to chew up the details and
dumb them down
and make them bite size.
Bite size.
Yeah,
that's good. Really, that's good advice.
Yeah,
that's good advice, and I understand that.
Yeah. You still have to pray a lot because it's been interesting to me that the cliche for now the last 30 or 40 years has been the ever reducing attention span of the American public. I would say, on the other hand, the attention span reduction is happening at the media level. They're the ones who can't pay attention for 4 minutes. We were the ones who watched the OJ trial for months and months on end. We had plenty of attention span, but the people that you're trying to pitch your story to about a disaster, or in our case, a crime, run into these people who go, yeah, but that was last week.
Mm-hmm. I could not agree with you more, and I devote a good bit of my book, Words Whispered in Water, on this exact topic and this disconnect with the media and media's, you can call it all kinds of things. You can call it laziness. You can call it, you could call it more worried about their careers than they are about the story. You can call it all kinds of things, but
well,
yes.
I would add that they've understaffed now under the profit pressure of these huge companies buying up most media.
I'll be honest, Harry, though. I've heard that line for 16 years. The same line, understaffed. And I've gotten to the point I don't believe it anymore.
Really?
Really, yeah.
Well, when's the last time? I mean, our reporter covering Pakistan is covering it from London. What better proof do you want than that? They don't have anybody. They don't have anybody within 12,000 miles of Pakistan.
So there's truth to it, but I also feel that reporters and journalists sometimes overuse that excuse to doing a better job. Sure. I think that's where I'm going with this. So, so thank you for making. And by the way, for the listeners who see a problem in their town or community, that's a relatively small group compared to what Harry and I had to do. We had to reach the whole country. So I hope that we've made this seem a little easier for you all and not harder. And by the way, there were other ways that I looked for ways to make this relevant to the entire country. And one of those was letting people know that levee failure and flooding has nothing to do with being at sea level.
Right.
You can have levee failure 4,200 feet above sea level, like
Mm-hmm.
what happened in the middle of the night. A levee breached in a little town in Nevada, 4,200 feet above sea level, flooded these people in the middle of the night in their bedrooms.
Mm-hmm.
Another example, 6 months later, a deluge flooded hundreds of homes in Reno. Okay, that is how many? 700 feet above sea level. And then another example in Wisconsin, 1,000 feet above sea level. A levee broke and emptied an entire lake into these people's homes. So don't feel that just because you're above sea level that you can't have levee failure and flooding. And that was a second way, and a second example on how I worked to make the issue relevant, because no matter how interesting your story is, if it's not relevant to the people you're talking to, they're just going to shut down very, very quickly.
I had a similar but different approach to that very problem. It struck me that while I had the experience of knowing the kind of work the Corps of Engineers does from having grown up around the Los Angeles River, the Army Corps of Engineers has sort of reveled in its own obscurity. Uh, and
Can
a
you
lot of
elaborate? I find that
yeah,
interesting.
yeah, I think a lot of people don't even know what that is, what they do. Um, you know, they are a masterful example of how the most powerful institutions in Washington often work behind the scenes.
Mm-hmm.
Their power lies in the fact that they have learned from their overlords at the Department of Defense. The way you have sway in Washington is to figure out some kind of project to put in the case of the Pentagon, a base, in the case of the Army Corps, a bridge, dredge a harbor, a levee, put something in every congressional district in Congress so that Michael Grunwald wrote a wonderful series of articles in 2000 in the Washington Post about the Army Corps. It was the first deep dive I'd ever seen. I put him in the movie as a result. And there's a thing called the Iron Triangle. The Army Corps pitches a project as after the Reagan Revolution of the 80s. The Corps was hollowed out, and a lot of the engineering prowess was uh, replaced by contracting out to
Exactly.
private companies.
Mm-hmm.
So you now have Congress, Congress people, Congress critters, which need money, private contractors who need contracts that are fueled by money, the Army Corps, which needs more projects to keep its own internal momentum going.
Yeah,
And
where there's money, there's power.
right, and these three nodes reinforce each other. The Corps gets Congressman people to approve a project. The Corps lets out the contracts. The contractors give money to help the Congress people get reelected. And it all happens, as I say, off the stage, where we normal people who watch the news maybe uh, don't hear about it, don't hear about them, don't hear about the Army Corps. So what I did, what I tried to do was say, this is not just New Orleans that has been victimized by the Army Corps of Engineers. This is not any vendetta they have against us. There's a story encapsulated in a book called Paving Paradise about how the Army Corps was given the job of enforcing the Clean Water Act in Florida with the goal of living up to the law that called for no net loss of wetlands. And after 30 years of the Army Corps' enforcement of that law, major net loss of wetlands. And of course, the Army Corps was instrumental in the near destruction of the Everglades. And then Congress gives them $7 billion and says, go fix it. So this is an agency whose
Mm-hmm.
business model is
Mm-hmm.
build it, break it, fix it.
Mm-hmm. I couldn't agree more. It's a real issue.
And so that was my way of saying, you may think
Mm,
the flooding of New Orleans doesn't affect you, but look around and see what's been done in your area by the Army Corps and think, how safe are you?
I think you worded that beautifully. And I think all of the listeners understand. I'm going to ask if there's anything else you can add, even let's say it's someone in your town or community and on a much smaller scale. Is there anything you can add about how making it relevant is important? Is there any little tips or tricks you can add?
Well, I think We are living in a time when people are trying to reinvent local news.
Mm-hmm.
And so um, go to, there's some communities in the country which have this thing called Patch, which are hyper local news sites. Um, and there are in New Orleans has one, Texas has one, a nonprofit newsroom that focuses on local news. So these are places where a story can be planted and start to grow.
It's called Patch, Patch.
Yes, I think
Thank you
there's,
very much for sharing that with us. I'm
yeah.
going to go check right now. You said New
And
Orleans has one of these sites.
New Orleans has a nonprofit newsroom, not a
Mm-hmm.
patch.
Mm-hmm.
I'm on the board of it. It's called the Lens, and of course Texas has the Texas Tribune. San
Mm-hmm.
Diego has the Voice of San Diego. There are a lot of nonprofit newsrooms that are catching catching on all over the country. And rather than go to the remaining local newspaper, which talk about stretched and understaffed local newspapers, traditional legacy newspapers are, but these new nonprofit newsrooms are hungry, they're ambitious, they're energetic, and they could run with a story that maybe the larger guys will pick up after the momentum is picked up. So I
Well,
would
our
go.
listeners in New Orleans now know all about the lens, and
Yeah,
listeners all over the country now know that they can look in their community or town for something called Patch and find out if there's an alternate news site besides these bullet news that we're all accustomed to getting. Every news
yeah,
story is a template. But not at the lens. I'm very familiar with the work of the lens. They don't follow that template. They actually do a story.
yeah, yeah.
They actually
They
do
do.
a story.
They do excellent work.
Well, thank you, Harry. Unless there's anything else you'd like to add, I think we can wrap up.
Well, I would say the the reason I made the film was to prevent the same thing from happening again. Unfortunately, uh, that didn't happen, and we have a new improved uh, risk reduction system. They won't even call it a hurricane protection
Mm-hmm.
system anymore. They don't dare.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and it has one big glaring challenge.
And what's that?
Well, the Army Corps never fixed the flood walls, the three flood walls that collapsed in the heart of the city.
Mm-hmm.
What they did was the part that fell over, they stood back up,
They
but
replaced those sections.
they replaced those sections. But their excuse for not replacing the whole wall was it's never going to be challenged again because we have new gates that will prevent the floodwater from coming into the canals, which is what the
That is
floodwater
their
did.
story. You're repeating it exactly right.
But as my whistleblower friend says, if there's a big rainfall event with a hurricane, the city will fill up with rainwater. And what it's supposed to do, what the system that the city built is supposed to do, is send that floodwater to those three canals. And since those flood walls that line those canals have never been fixed, a rain event above a certain level will challenge them.
Will cause them to collapse. They
Yes.
call it a safe water level. I
Yes.
like to call it a dangerous water level. But they have the water is only allowed to go to about 7 feet from the tops of the walls. They were built to hold the water all the way, but
Yes.
now the Corps shut the gates when it's 7 feet above. And the whistleblower, I guess she's saying that if the water gets even a little bit higher than that safe water mark, that could cause the wall to collapse, and then
Yep.
we have another event like we had 16 years ago.
Yes. And in 2012, I forget the name of the hurricane. It was a really first challenge of all this. And
Isaac,
it could be. Do you know
the
Matt
one
Mc?
that stayed and rained and rained and rained for 3 days.
No, it wasn't that one. I don't think. But
Okay,
Matt. You know Matt McBride,
of
right?
course.
Yeah. Well, Matt went in after the event and FOIA'd communications from inside the Corps of Engineers. They lost all remote sensing of the water levels at those canals.
I remember you're talking about a rain event
Yeah.
that occurred, not a hurricane event.
Not a hurricane.
Sorry, my fault. A
Yeah.
rain event that occurred about 3 years ago.
Yeah. And the Corps lost all remote sensors
Hmm.
of where the
Hmm.
water was in those canals and had to drive around in pouring rain
Hmm.
trying to eyeball whether
Hmm.
the walls were being challenged yet.
Hmm.
So we're dancing on, raindrops.
And thank you to Matt McBride. Now, the power of a single person is
Yes.
alive and well. And Matt McBride is I'm sure he'll forgive me for calling him a geek, but he gets into the data and then he disseminates it and he's
He talk
just
about
suts it out.
talk
He
about getting into the weeds.
he
That
doesn't talk about getting into the weeds. And I begged him to please give me a tweet sized version of his million page post he does, and he will do that for me. You have to ask him to do it,
mhm.
but he doesn't operate as a team. He operates as a single individual, but it works. And if don't ever feel like you don't have the power to do anything, you do. But it is a little easier if you can create a group, which is what Beat the Big Guys is all about. It's creating a group of people to get something done. And the focus of today was to take whatever your campaign is, whatever your problem is, make it relevant to as big a group as you can. And even if it's only 15 or 20 people, that's often big enough. Well, Harry,
Matt,
is there anything else you'd like to
yeah,
add?
yeah, I just want to explain. Matt is an
Sure.
engineer, and he is a person who can go in and read the drawings and the documents and the charts and interpret them for normal people.
Hmm.
And it's always in any kind of campaign, it's always great to have somebody who can stand up to the so-called experts and say, "I read this stuff, I understand this
Hmm.
stuff. You're lying."
Absolutely. And there'll be other episodes. This is the launch year, the launch season of Beat the Big Guys. And we'll be getting in much more into how to harness and use the advice and wisdom of experts. And we'll have whole episodes devoted exclusively just to that. But it's good
Great.
that you brought this up. And yes, Matt McBride is an expert, and he's reliable, he's smart, and he's right. He's always right.
Yeah. In his heart, he's right. Well,
Is there anything else? Mhm.
oh, I was just going to say, I was glad to have been part of this show, Sandy, and congratulations on the podcast. Congratulations on the book, as I said to you off the air. And I'll see you soon.
Yes. Thank you so much, Harry. This has been a lot of fun. Maybe we can do it again.
Yeah.
Thank you again, Harry, for joining me. And I hope all of you enjoyed this episode. Make sure to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast on all of your favorite platforms. And remember, no matter who you are, you can beat the big guys. Okay, it's a wrap. And I didn't
Yay.
forget to press record.